The Darkangel Chapter 8 Quest and Flight. The journey was long and at the same time swift. The river veered first right, then left, and seemed to be descending in a strange, irregular spiral through the rock on which the vampire's castle rested. It ran down, ever down, through an endless series of natural chambers. Some were huge and wide, filled with curtains and columns, and pointed pedestals of crystal lime. Others were long and low, more tunnels than chambers. In one there was an opening in the wall, through which she could see the stars in their pale light, and the brighter, warmer glow of the river. She saw this was a haven of the bats. They flew in and out of the opening and through the cave like silver moths, and many of them clung to the walls and ceilings like a mass of withered leaves. Their twittering, what she could hear of it, was high and wild and airy thin. Iriel laughed, and was surprised to hear how thick and deep her voice sounded next to theirs. Another chamber, hours later, further down into the heart of the mountain, was latticed with silver combs, dripping honey like liquid amber. The great stingless bees that tended the combs were greyish gold with bands of rose, and covered with velvet fur. She watched them crawling about their waxworks, building the six-sided chambers, filling them with the sweet thick honey, feeding their pale formless young. On the far side of the room, on the greatest comb of all, Ariel beheld the queen, larger than the rest, surrounded by her nurses and the clumsy drones. Then, much further on, after Iriel had drifted into sleep, she awoke to find herself in the greatest chamber she had yet seen. It was huge and dark. She could not see the limit before or behind. What she could see was the ceiling above, dotted with glowworms, whose pale yellow light burned like phosphor. The air itself was filled with fireflies that hovered in the dark like candle flames. The stream ran nearly flat here, and Iriel realized it must have emerged from the mountains now and be running under the plains. The cave of the glowworms ran on and on. She fell asleep again and dreamed she was riding through deep heaven surrounded by stars. When next she awoke, the first thing she thought was that she was still in the cave of the glowworms, but then she noticed that the lights overhead were smaller, silver, and Oceanus shone hoary blue in the middle heavens off to the right. There was a narrow beach on either side of her, then low steep banks. The second thing she noticed was that her little craft was no longer moving. Its sail was full, and it still bounced and bobbled in the bright water off the stream, but it had run aground on a little sandy shoal. She got out of the boat to try and free it, but before she could do so much as lay a hand on it, it bounded away from her, merry as a greyhound. Then Iriel remembered she must abandon the boat anyway, now that she had reached the plain, as it was as well it had abandoned her. She checked to see the small velvet bag was still firmly tied to her belt, then walked across the beach and scrambled up the bank. At the top of the bank she looked back at the stream for a last view of wind on water, but she saw no sign of her, only a great heron winging low over the river running. The bird shone very white, whiter than pure snow in the earthshine. It beat its wings twice, veered right, and rose out of the gorge into the night-dark sky. Iriel watched it sail away over the plain towards Oceanus. The wind blew over Averic, bowing the grass and lifting Iriel's hair. She laughed. She had not realized how much the vampire's castle had oppressed her until now that she was free of it. Looking back, she saw it only as a tiny point on the far horizon. She said the rhyme then once more softly to herself. On Averic's white plain, where the Icarus now wings, to steeps of terrain from tour of kings, and damsels twice seven his brides have all become, a far cry from heaven and a long road from home. Then strong hoof of the star horse must hallow him on guest, if adamant's edge is to plunder his breast. Then only may the war horse and the warrior arise, to rally the war hosts and thunder the skies. Then she turned her face towards Oceanus, and set off across the plain. The trip proved more arduous than she had imagined. She walked long hours through the high grey-green grass, then sank down to rest, her legs trembling. She ate of the foods in the little pouch, and she slept on the bare ground, which was light and springy. The wind on the plain was warm, and she did not feel the want of a fire. Sometimes, far away to the right or left, she saw small birds or wild asses with bands of gold and green streaking their flanks. Also she saw antelope, grass hens, and once 2 wild hunting dogs of mottled grey and tan. They watched her from a distance and yipped softly, but no more. Gradually, as the fortnight wore on, and all the walks and stops and sleeps blended into one, the stars shifted, and Oceanus, waxing to full and then waning again, rose a little higher in the sky. As she moved on across the plain, the soil grew looser and drier. The grass stood shorter and sparser. Eventually, the grass gave way to a low scrub, and when at last the sun rose over the western mountains, Iriel found herself at the edge of the scrubland and the beginning of the dunes. She set off at once across the sand, which was white with a pale orange cast to it. Though utterly dry, it had a faint cohesion. A sort of crust had formed on the surface of the sand. Though this was neither thick nor strong, Iriel found that if she stepped lightly and carefully, it would not break beneath her weight. But if she stepped hard or paused a moment in her pace, the surface crumbled and her feet sank ankle-deep in soft, coarse sand. She had not been travelling long after sunrise, nor had she gotten very far in the desert when she heard a faint shout far in the distance behind her. She paused, startled. It had been almost a fortnight since she had heard a human voice. She half turned, puzzled, expectant, almost elated at the thought of meeting someone, anyone. And then the soft crust crumbled beneath her feet. She saw him, the Darkangel, coursing towards her out of the north like the great hawk on his wings of utter black. She had no thought of hiding, for where there could she hide, nor of facing him. If she were to save the wraiths, she realized she must not let him take her, and the whole of the Durra's as yet untold plan now rested on her as well. She ran. Light across the surface of sand she ran. It held just long enough for her foot to leave its face before caving in, to leave a jagged row of footmarks in the dunes. Over one rise and then the next she fled. She felt her hair streaming out behind her. She did not look behind. The dunes sped past for a long time, it seemed, many heartbeats. Her breath was running short, her pulse was racing, her legs were growing tired, and then she gasped as she felt the wind of the Darkangel's wings on her back, and knew he was in the air above her and just behind. "Turn around!" he cried. His words were a deafening snarl. "Turn around and face me!" She did not listen, she did not answer. She ran on. He swooped. She fell to the sand and rolled. His wingtips brushed her cheek, then he was gone, rising into the air for another pass. Iriel got to her feet and fled. The sand had broken when she had dived. There was sand in her hair now, in her eyes, in her ears. She battered it from her lips and sucked in her breath and ran on. The vampire swooped again, not deep enough. She ducked and dodged the continuous running, and continued running. The Icarus gave a scream of rage and pulled up for another try. His scream was answered from across the dunes, sounded a roar. Rolling, thundering, Iriel spun around. Behind her on the crest of a dune stood a great beast, a lion with a mane of gold. His body was white golden and he shone like the sun. The Icarus screamed again in his rage, and the lion challenged him with a roar that shook the air. For a moment she thought they would battle. The Darkangel hovered in the black sky just above him. The bright lion crouched ready to spring. Then suddenly the Icarus turned and rushed headlong through the air towards Iriel. The great lion sprang in pursuit. Iriel started like a deer and fled. They were both behind her and very close. She could hear the lion's paws touching the sand, the vampire's wings beating the still air. They were closing on her rapidly. Presently she caught sound of their breathing, the Darkangel's harsh and hoarse, the lion's smooth and deep. She realized they would reach her at almost the same instant, and had just decided she would surely be torn apart between them when the vampire caught her. First by her hair, then by her arm, he hoisted her aloft. His hand was so cold it burned. She looked into his eyes and they were colourless as egg white, ferocious and full of madness. He bit her throat near her shoulder and Iriel screamed. The lion sprang. His collision with the Darkangel jolted her and staggered the vampire in mid-air. The Icarus shrieked and let go of her as the great cat raked his face. Pressed between the two of them, she could not fall. Her right side froze and trembled against the Darkangel's bloodless flesh, while her left side burned and writhed in the heat of the lion's body. With his other paw, the great cat dragged 4 long gashes down the vampire's shoulder. The Icarus twisted away. The lion dropped to the earth. Iriel fell and lay stunned on the sand. looking above her at the deep bloodless wounds in the Darkangel's face and shoulder. Before the vampire could recover himself, the lion had sprung between him and Iriel. The pale golden cat's huge head bent over her. She shut her eyes and prepared to die. His mouth closed, gently, firmly, over her arm. Pulling her up, he half shrugged, half slung her over his shoulder, and then he bounded off in great strides across the dunes. Iriel lay dazed. Her throat where the Icarus had bitten her was an agony of fire and ice. She felt so winded she could hardly breathe. She felt her arm held hard in the lion's mouth. His great pointed teeth pressed into her flesh, but they did not so much as break the skin. She felt the rush of wind along her body and the movement of the lion's lithe, hard muscles beneath the skin as he ran. His coat was soft and warm as sunlight, and she sensed that beneath his flesh was hotter still. He smelt like heated oil and sandalwood. She saw the Icarus in the sky behind them. He made no attempt to follow, but he hovered in the air, watching them, screaming in his fury. The rhythm of his churning raven wings seemed altered somehow, rougher, oddly strained. She could not fathom it. He grew further away with each bound of the lion. At last she saw him turn and start a slow, limping flight back southward towards the castle. Then Iriel realized she was bleeding from the throat. Blood streamed from the wound the vampire had made. She felt cold. She shivered. The wind was cooling and drying the blood on her kirtle, and it made the pale, soaked garment cling to her side. She stared at it, appalled. Presently she grew very light-headed, and in a little time more felt herself slipping into a swoon. When she awoke, she was lying on the sand. The sun was hot on her face. Her throat ached. There was an intermittent sound of splashing over to her left. She listened to it, not wanting yet to open her eyes. She was just beginning to drift into a dream when a few drops of water sprinkled her cheek. She heard the plash of water again, and in a moment more drops fell. She blinked and opened her eyes. The lion sat on the sand beside her, shaking water from one great paw onto her face. "Ah, you are awake, child," he said. His voice was very quiet and deep. "How do you feel? Can you rise?" "I don't know," she said. "I feel weak." The lion nodded. "That is to be expected. The bite of an Icarus is no mean thing. Come, you must try to sit up. Your wound must be attended to." Iriel pulled herself upright into a sitting position. For a moment the sky tilted crazily and threatened to fall. She rested her head on her knees. Only now did she begin to wonder that she was not dead, that the lion had rescued her from the vampire, and that he spoke with a human manner and a voice. She rested her head on her knees. She knew there was water nearby. She reached out her hand and felt wet sand, then liquid. She dipped her hand into the water and brought her cup palm to her lips and drank a little, but swallowing was painful and difficult. She bathed her neck. The wound burned at the touch of water, but she felt the pain ease. She drank again. The water was warm and faint, blue-green in colour. Its taste reminded her vaguely of cress, and it smelled of life. She raised her head from her knees a bit and saw she was sitting beside a tiny pool, hardly more than a puddle in the sand. A sprinkling of miniature water plants dotted the surface, and among them a handful of tiny frogs chirping. She saw 4 snails with spiral shells on the bottom and 2 at the water's edge. "There," said the lion. "Does that help the hurt?" Iriel started. He sat so unobtrusively, she almost had forgotten him. "Yes," she said weakly. "Much." "Strain some of the floating plants out of the water with your hand, then plaster them to your wound," he instructed. "They will help it more than just the water." Iriel did so. The little flecks of green were surprisingly pungent, and when she pressed them to her neck, their oily coating seeped into the wound with a soothing warmth. Gradually the cold, numbing ache began to abate. Still she felt giddy and at times almost faint, but no more in pain. After a time, she realized she was hungry, and without thinking, she reached into her pouch for food. Then she remembered the lion suddenly and glanced at him. "Are you hungry?" she inquired timidly. "Would you like something to eat?" Despite his reserved and gentle manner, she still felt a lingering fear of being leapt upon and devoured. The lion bowed his head with consummate grace and replied, "I should be honoured." She fumbled in the little bag, rejecting first the rose pear and then the stalk of sweet cane that came to hand. At last she found something suitable, a boiled crayfish. She held it out to him timorously, half afraid. that he would snap it up in his great jaws and her hand along with it. Instead, he bent his head and took it carefully. Then, reclining, he placed the crustacean between his paws and proceeded to peel it with a delicacy and a dignity she could scarce believe. She felt foolish and ill-mannered, nibbling on a small globe of cheese she had taken for herself. "Would you like something else?" she asked, when he'd done. "Thank you, daughter. No," he said graciously. "You must save the rest for yourself." Iriel saw now that he had taken her first offering not from hunger but from courtesy. At least she was glad to see he was not ravenous. She nibbled her cheese and felt very worn. "You saved me from the vampire," she said at last. "Why?" "It's my duty to protect all things within my borders, child," the great cat replied, "and I am not particularly fond of Icari." "I never saw you before he came," said Iriel. "Were you nearby all the while?" "Oh, no, daughter, no. I had to come a great distance to find you." "To find me?" said Iriel. Her head was feeling heavy. She rested it on her hand. "You knew I was coming?" The lion nodded. "A white heron told me you would be crossing my south border about dawn. I had already been patrolling for some hours before I spotted you." "A white heron?" murmured Iriel. "Wind on the water!" "Perhaps she was so called once," the lion said. "But when she came to see me, she said her name was Wing on the Wind." Iriel said nothing. Her eyelids drooped. Her stomach lay full in her and slightly queasy. She felt restless and drowsy at once. The sky tilted slowly off to the left. "Lie back on the sand, child," the lion was saying. His voice sounded far, a very long way away. "You are fainting." Iriel lay back on the sand. The world steadied a little. "I must find the star horse," she murmured, "the equestrial." The lion bent over her again. "Daughter, I know your quest," he said. "The white heron told me, but you have lost much blood to this wound, and will be a while yet healing. I will give you into the hands of the desert folk, who will tend to you until you are fit to travel again." Iriel shook her head and muttered something. She did not want to wait. There was no time. It would be not many months before the vampire took another bride, his final bride. She must find the star horse and return with him to the Durrow before that. Before she found herself too weak to make protest to the lion, her eyelids slid shut, and she slipped into a doze. Later she half awoke, or perhaps it was a dream of strange music played on woodwinds and tambours, and of a long train of dark people with banners and walking sticks, and of their leader, a tall woman, conferring with the lion. Iriel could not hear what they were saying, though now and then they glanced back at her. The lion and the woman parted. Iriel watched him disappear over the dunes. The dark people came and stood about her. Then, lifting her carefully onto a litter, they quietly bore her away.